Buju, Wago Shindagu, Migizi and Dodame, Minawa, Gaza Gasquaji Mekog, and Dunjaba. I'm just about to the point where I have the president and the deans at my university convinced that if somebody calls and asks for the Department of Foreign Languages, to send them to the English department. And if somebody needs something else, then come talk to me. Ultimately, that really is how it is. English is a language that comes from across the ocean, a country called England, and Ojibwe is one of the indigenous languages of this space right here. So I think it is time to center that. I know we're in, through no fault of our own, a lot of our people didn't grow up as fluent speakers, so I'll probably do most of my remarks in English, but I'll use some Ojibwe as we go. In my Ojibwe introduction, I was sharing that my native name is Wagush, which means fox. I come from the Eagle clan, and most of my family is from the village of Bena on the Leech Lake Reservation. My mother and grandmother and great-grandmother were all enrolled at White Earth, but they were actually out of the Pokegama village, which is kind of near Grand Rapids, and they got relocated to Bena, but they enrolled everybody at White Earth. So we never had anyone who lived there. But I spend a lot of time at White Earth. I'm on a couple of the ceremonial drums over there, and spend a lot of time, really throughout the region, mainly around ceremonies. And I kind of sit on a three-legged stool. So one of those is my community and ceremony work. So I officiate for naming ceremonies, traditional Ojibwe funerals, and all kinds of other things. All of that work is, uncompensated and at the service of our people in our tradition. But I also do work at the university where I teach our language, history, culture. And then I also do a lot of work around diversity, equity, and inclusion. And that kind of work, sometimes it's, for Native institutions or Native serving ones, and sometimes it's, for predominantly white spaces or mixed spaces that are trying to figure out how to do better around all things, racial. I think ultimately, even in the DEI space, Native voices and concerns still get marginalized, even in that space. And so I think there's really a tremendous amount of work to do. To me, those three things, community service, language and culture, DEI, it's kind of like three strands of a braid. They all feed and connect to one another in many different ways. I'll share a PowerPoint for a little bit. They are recording this session and we'll be able to share that. I'll make sure that a copy of my PowerPoint is shared with the hosts and available to attendees as well. All right. So first, for the sharing, this should be the one. Everybody seeing this okay? All right, holler at me if you're not. So this is one of my elders, the late great Tom Stillday, who is from the village of Panema on the Red Lake Reservation. I'm sure many of you have been up to Red Lake before. Panema is an interesting place. No one there has ever been baptized. 100% traditional Ojibwe religious belief and funeral practice. Among other things, people bury their dead in the front yard and have spirit houses where people are buried. And so, it makes it harder to mow, but it's also harder to sell the family farm and move to California, so to speak. And it's not just because of the status of land at Red Lake, but you step out the door to your house and there's mom, dad, grandma, grandpa, generation upon generation older than America. And it affects us. As Indigenous people, our connection to place is one of the defining features of our identity. And even though half of our enrolled tribal citizenry lives off reservation and 70% of the self-identified Native population lives off reservation, so our experiences are not simply a reservation experience, that at the same time, even for those who move, off the reservation for any number of reasons, the reconnecting to place, be it for a powwow, culture, community, funerals, is still something that is really significant and formative in identity. Where my family's from in Bena, same thing. Our family members have been buried in the same place longer than America has been a country, and it just feels different. Well, Tom was pretty interesting. He was named chaplain for the Minnesota State Senate, and he was the first person from a religious tradition that did not come from across the ocean who was named to that position. That also says something about colonization and how it works, right? The supplanting of language, culture, customs, religion. In any event, he was pretty fun. He'd say, "I'm praying for politicians. Boy, do they need it." And that was even before some of the things we've seen in more recent years. We had him at Bemidji State University to give a speech, graduation banquet speech for our Native students, which I always remember fondly because I had been campaigning to bring him there. Finally, they said, "Go ahead." And then I had to talk to Tom, who was notoriously long-winded, and said, "Tom, you have, 15 minutes, throw in a good joke or two, focus on the students, and then we have a lot of awards to hand out." He said, "Sure, no problem." Got up there, he spoke for about an hour and a half. He did the whole thing in the Ojibwe language. He didn't use any English at all. And then when he was all done, he only said one thing in English. He said, "All you people who study Indians, study that." And he went and sat down. So I thought he was hilarious. But he had good points. Most of the books written about Native people were written by non-Native people, most of whom hadn't even talked to one of us or spent time in one of our places. And it wasn't just the history books. It was also the curriculum development plan. It's the school turnaround plan, the suicide prevention plan, the substance abuse intervention plan, the economic development plan. They're looking at studies and data and information of totally different groups and expecting the same results with us, and then getting really confused that it's not going according to plan. So ultimately, we need Indigenous informed and Indigenous led efforts with everything that we do. Among the hats that I get to wear is I sit on the school board for Wadukodading Ojibwe Language Institute. It is the world's first Ojibwe medium school. And by Ojibwe medium, what I mean is they don't just teach the kids a little bit about Ojibwe, they run the whole school in Ojibwe. So when it's time to talk about math, Anish Minikwa, Dash Gaganjagadeg, Yo, Minawad, Mamawi Tuyang, Oma, Anish Minik, they'll go through the whole math unit in Ojibwe, and they do the social studies. Gadawin de Munanim Gapi Eshewebak, Chimeweja, Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo, and they'll just explain about those things too. So the language is the language of instruction. And I've only been on the school board there for a couple of years, but prior to that, I actually did a lot of work with their staff. And their staff, by the way, is heavily assessed. They get assessed on all kinds of things, including their listening, speaking, reading, and writing abilities in Ojibwe, their use of immersion teaching, pedagogy, all kinds of things. And I was there with their early childhood program doing classroom observations, and I was simply blown away. For starters, there's a 4-year-old kid running class. And the kid got up there and said, "Buju abenuji dogani nejiweba kaguchi nongum." And one of the kids raised her hand and said, "Anizagate hakadebwe, awegunengeabi nodin and a hat mushkawani mud." And so these kids are going back and forth. The one kid saying, "What's happening with the weather today?" And one of the kids says, "The sun's coming out." So he puts up he had a felt board behind him and put up an image of the sun peeking out behind a cloud. What else is going on? Is there wind? Yeah, there's a strong wind. He put up another image for that. And I was watching this thinking, I can't even get my kids to sit still for supper. So what was happening in terms of classroom management and the academic ability of these kids and the confidence and poise of a 4-year-old child to stand up and kind of facilitate a classroom exercise like that. It was truly awesome. And it wasn't like they had 20 years in a program and they finally got to this level. The kids were 4 and 5 years old. So, and they were operating in a language their parents did not speak at home. So to me, there are many, many things going on at that early childhood and early grades level. It's just really, really important to be prepared for and tune into. So for starters, kids' minds learn very quickly. Their socialization in school is also critically important. And, they, like a 5-year-old kid might be learning their letters, and a 6-year-old kid is learning sight words. And some of those 7 and 8-year-old kids are into chapter books. Some are even reading Harry Potter. And the explosion into literacy happens very quickly. By the way, if you get a kid literate, like they're a reader, you're never putting that genie back in the bottle. They're a reader for life. And if somebody gets passed forward year upon year and never quite gets it, the effects are also permanent. So there's this like sobering but also empowering reality that what's going on in schools has a profound effect on kids. And what I'm seeing is this, when we do something like what is happening at Wadukadading, those kids light up. They become so empowered and so engaged, and their core academic accomplishment, community engagement, sense of self-worth is so positively benefited by that. You cannot put a price on it. I'll return to this in just a minute to speak about it in a curricular sense too, and we'll do a little more yet on our Thursday session. But for now, it's just important to impress upon you how incredibly powerful it is when our kids get to learn about themselves as well as the rest of the world. By the way, Minnesota, for example, loves to toot its own horn, like we're a great education state and so forth. And if you look at aggregate test data, even though those are highly flawed measures, but if you look at that, the states that do the best in terms of test scores are Minnesota, North Dakota, Iowa, Wisconsin, Michigan. Do we see a pattern here? And the states with the worst racially predictable disparities in education are the very same states. How can that be? It's like the whiter the state, the whiter the body of teachers, the better the white students do, and the worse everybody else does. Well, that can't be right. Those are realities, but it's not morally right. We can't afford to have an educational system that's like a white empowerment program. You say the words and people cringe. But the systems that we have been operating in regionally do well by their white learners and not so well by everybody else. So instead of doing the same thing and doing it harder, teaching the native kids how to jump through the gates and the gaps, we just need entirely different systems. And when you give them entirely different systems like they do at Wadukadading, guess what? Kids thrive. I'll share one brief story. This is one of my sons. His name's Evan Neobanese, and picture is a couple years old. But when the pandemic hit and they sent all the kids home and everybody had to learn on a computer, he was protesting. And he was protesting very effectively because he would change his screen name to reconnecting, ... shut off his camera, and be doing anything but whatever that teacher was telling him to do. And which I have to admit was kind of clever. But I had to tell him, like, if you spend as much effort at the work as you did at the work avoidance, think where we'd be. And he would say things like, but Dad, all I want to do is be outside. And the gym teacher makes me quit running around outside, come inside, and take a picture doing a stretch or a jumping jack. And if she just left me alone, I'd be getting so much more exercise. It's kind of hard to argue with that one. And so I said, okay, son, tell you what, why don't you tell me what you want to learn about? And he said, can it be outside? I said, sure, of course it can be outside. There's lots to learn outside. Okay, I pick birds, like birds, perfect. So my idea, I'd get like books on bird taxonomy, field guide to the birds. He said, no, I need you to get me a bag of bird seed. So I said, all right, we're going to try this your way. So I went and got a bag of bird seed. He put on a hat. He put bird seed around his hat, put some in his hands, and went outside like this. I was watching thinking, this is not going to work. But I didn't want to tell him that or pop his bubble, so I just let him go. So he's outside, he's like 45 minutes, his hands are getting shaky, nothing happened. Day 2, this is a stubborn kid. He's out there again, hands shaking, nothing happened. Day 3, and I was just about to pull the plug on the whole thing. And then on the 4th day, some birds landed on the edge of his hat, started to eat some bird seed, and I was thinking, no way. And I just let him go for a little while. And pretty soon he was kind of like Dr. Dolittle. I don't know if you remember that old movie. He'd go outside like this, and birds would like land on his arms, shoulders, head. He didn't even need the bird seed. He started flipping through the books and doing some other things too. So then I thought, Mr. Educator, it's time for an assessment. All right, kid, tell me what you're learning about these birds. And he said, well, Dad, look at them. They are all so different from one another. Do you see that one over there? It looks kind of like a chickadee. But if you look further down on his body, he's got these red marks. It's called a red poll. And they actually act different than the chickadees too. This one over here, that's a cedar waxwing. It's a little different than the Bohemian waxwing. You can tell because of these color striations right here. That one over there, that's a blue jay. Everybody knows what a blue jay is. They're kind of loud and obnoxious, but they're actually more standoffish from human beings than some of these smaller birds. Well, except for that one. His name's Jerry. And I was just kind of amazed listening to this kid. I think even to this day, that kid knows more about birds than I do. And it was a reminder to me that just because I'm the dad didn't mean that I knew more either about the topic or about how my kid needs to learn. Just because I'm a trained educator didn't mean that I knew more about how that kid needed connection and content to be shared. And so I think it's pretty clear that the Western toolbox for the most part is focused on writing, written tests, teachers who absorb all of the information and give it to passive students who take a written test. And that not everybody learns that way. Some of us are more auditory learners. Some of us are more kinetic. We need to get up and move around to experience things, and then we get it. And so some schools will do things like the Hawaiian schools have been doing this. If there's core curricular, they've identified 5 primary learning styles. They try to share it with the kids in each of the major learning styles that they have identified, which I thought was pretty cool and innovative. There's so much we could learn from the Hawaiians and what they do and how they do it. They're really kind of heroes to me, the Native Hawaiians. 30 years ago, a little over 30 years ago now, their language was illegal for use in public schools. And they were down to 1,000 speakers of Hawaiian left on planet Earth. Half of them lived in one isolated island community called Niihau, and the other 500 were elders over 70. It was not looking good. Today, Hawaiian is one of the official languages for the state of Hawaii. They have 24,000 speakers of Hawaiian. 3,000 of the speakers are first speakers who've learned it as their first language in the home. And you can go to school from daycare to early childhood, all the way through high school, and even get a college degree, all with Hawaiian as the language of instruction. Pretty cool. So they tripled the population of first speakers, multiplied 24-fold the number of speakers. It's exciting and innovative. And I think some of their approaches in education are really showing us something exciting too. So I first got interested in Hawaii because of Indigenous language revitalization, but I quickly learned some other things too. Minnesota is a very inequitable state. Some school districts get funded at $4,000 per student, and some are funded at $40,000 per student, 10 times the money. And then if something goes wrong at a school, they'll say it's the fault of the teachers or the fault of the poverty of that community. But we are funding things at 10 times the money for some schools and 10 times less for others. That's gross. By the way, in the Hubert Humphrey administration in Minnesota, we had equal per pupil funding. So there's a way to do that. Hawaii declared the whole state one school district for funding purposes. Excuse me. They didn't get rid of all inequities, but it took away one lever. A rich area can still do a bonding bill and juice it for their kids, you know. But it was a start. And when I went there, I found some other really cool things. So, you know, I don't know if you've ever sat through on one of these, like, developing the mission statement for an organization and the value statement. Oftentimes, to be perfectly honest, I feel like I wish they just pull one off the internet and leave me alone, because by the time they check it down with everybody, it boils down to, we believe in education. I'm like, see, could have pulled that one off the internet. But once in a while, I've been part of one that has been really formative and really powerful. And it identifies who we are as an organization, where we want to go, and we hold one another accountable to these values and things like that, where it can be very powerful. And the Hawaiians did that. So they're in their stated values, kind of like how you might hear in an Ojibwe context, we talk about 7 grandfather teachings, things like that. They'd actually identified 12 traditional values. And number 1 was aloha, hello, goodbye, and I love you. So at the start of school every day, the whole staff is lined up in rows waiting outside the school. Of course, this is Hawaii and it's warm, you know, but then here come the kids, and the kids have to line up in rows facing the staff. And then the kids have to initiate communication by singing in the Polynesian tradition. That's what these kids are doing in this image here. So they're singing, asking for permission to come into school. And then when the staff feels they're sincere, they sing back. And then every kid gets a hug from everybody who works there at the start of school every day. Aloha, mahalo nui loa, so good to have you. You know, and it's pretty cool. By the way, we've brought students a number of times from Bemidji State over to Hawaii to visit these schools. And when we get there, their staff is lined up in rows waiting in front of the school, and I have to line up all of our people and make them sing. And you should see the awkwardness of Minnesotans having to sing for permission to come into school. It is awesome. But then they sing back, and all of our students get hugged by everybody who works there. And to be honest, a lot of our students are crying. Maybe because they're from Minnesota and they've never been hugged before. I don't know. But it is powerful. So it says aloha. And I think in the mainstream, we'd be saying something like, are you serious? 45 minutes on cultural enrichment at the start of school. Every day, the kids are awake in the morning. Make them do math. Until you realize that they do not have a statistically significant truancy problem. Nawahi, their flagship immersion school, has a 100% graduation rate. Every one of those kindergartners coming in will graduate with a high school diploma coming out. If anyone else has any schools that have data anywhere close to that, they can give the lectures. But until then, if someone's figuring some of this stuff out, maybe we should pay a little more attention to that. And someone is figuring some of this stuff out. America's kind of interesting. We have the blessing and the curse of a lot of local control in education. The curse is it's impossible to have like a national education policy that's like really meaningful, or a national health policy that does anything. We saw that during the pandemic. But the blessing is there's room for innovation at the local level. And certainly within a tribal context, we have seen room for innovation. You know, in Netawash on the White Earth Reservation, some years ago, the families had been asking for language and culture for years, and it was just falling, you know, on unlistening ears within the public school system. And so finally, they created a charter school. And guess what happened? All but 4 kids signed up for the charter school. So the public school didn't even have enough per pupil funding for 1 teacher position. So they had to close the public school. And the charter school turned around and rented the public school facility and moved right in and took over. And it's a, you know, just an indicator of what can and will happen if a school doesn't listen to the Native folks in their community. And that doesn't mean that everything's perfect in the Netawash school, not by any means, but it was a flex by the families that did produce some significant change. And I think there's a lot more room, both for the flexing and for the change. And above all, we have to remember what our kids need and what our kids deserve. There's much more to say about the Hawaiian schools, the way they're structured and function. I'll mention just a couple of things that might give you some indicators of how this stuff can work. So, for example, when they accept a new kid, they don't say we matriculate a kid, they say we matriculate an entire family. And so they assemble the families and they have to go out and pick medicines. And then they meet and together they weave a giant lei, kind of like a wreath that goes over the door to the school. And so the kids have to walk through that every day. When they do this, there's kind of an exchange of promises between the families and the school, where the parents have to say to the school, we are entrusting to you our most sacred human being, our daughter, and we are asking you to accept her into your ohana. Ohana is the Hawaiian word for family, which is their second stated value, aloha, ohana. And we are asking you to love her and respect her and look out for her well-being as you would your very own. And the school has to answer back, we are humbled and honored that you have thought us worthy to receive your most sacred human being, your daughter. We will accept her into our ohana. We will love her like our own. We will cherish her like our own and respect her and look out for her well-being as we would our very own. It's so powerful. It's so simple, but so powerful. And it does something to get in front of parents warehousing kids with a school and feeling resentful of school officials. And it gets in front of, school officials resenting families and how come they're not showing up for parent-teacher conferences, even though there could be 1,000 answers to that question. And it just does something to get people on the same page. When they do discipline, you probably heard of lomi massage, like work the bad stuff out. They'll have a lomi circle, restorative justice practice, basically. They meet under the lei that their parents picked. And if Joey hit Johnny, he'll talk about it. And then whoever lomis gets a hug from everybody in the circle and it rehabilitates relationship. They have very few discipline problems. And so we're not going to take the Hawaiian way of doing things and appropriate that. And all of a sudden we're saying aloha and ohana and things like that. But it's a way to think about how that Indigenous example did something positive for their kids around the positive identity development of those kids. What could we do in an Ojibwe context, or for our Dakota brothers and sisters, or for other tribes? What would be a tribally appropriate cultural context for building the positive identity of our Native kids? And that is a great question to ask, and I think we have some wonderful answers. Yeah, there's much more to share about the Hawaiian stuff, but I like the way that they have infused a philosophy throughout everything that they do. By the way, their ancient custom when a baby was born, and about a week later, the stub of the umbilical cord falls off of the belly button. They would go out to the lava beds and carve a divot, like one of these little holes, put the belly button there, put a rock on top. They'd remember their spots. And then they go to the next, like when their next kid is born, they'd go back to their spot and put another one and another one. And so all of these divots are for kids born in a line. And theirs is a matrilineal system. So when a girl grows up and becomes a mother, she'll go to her divot spot and put a circle around it and then put divots where her babies go. And so when you go out to the lava beds and it's acres and acres of divots and circles, it's pretty cool. And it's like bonding them to their matrilineal line, to the Aina, Mother Earth. And they have these little teachings like babies should stay near their moms. Kids can go off and go to school, but they should stay on their island. Adults can go out and represent the community and travel the world, but elders should come back and be on their island again. And there's a purpose for this. And they have this word in the Hawaiian language they call maoli, which means like strong spiritual fire. And when you ask them, why do you do language and culture stuff in your school systems? They have the same answer. It's because of Maoli, spiritual fire. Well-tended fires grow strong, and neglected fires grow weak. So we want our kids to have strong Maoli. It's not just about another pretty bird singing in the forest. It's about strong, healthy human beings. And they are delivering the results. There's some other things that'll kind of point in these directions. I'll share a couple things happening in Ojibwe country that to me have also been very exciting and empowering. You know, our people have been through a lot of stuff. We really have. And it's important to remember that it's through no fault of our own that there was such an effort to erode our language, our culture, and you know the strength of our nations and many different things like that. But here we are. There's no way to change what has happened in the past. As we go forward, we do need to think about which things do we pick up and what things do we leave behind. And in my view, the language and culture stuff is stuff we need to pick up. I was called to a meeting in Mille Lacs, one of our neighboring tribes. And you know, at White Earth, about 2/3 of the White Earth population came from central Minnesota. So if you're enrolled at White Earth, and you look at your enrollment and the band association, if it says Mississippi band, that means you came out of central Minnesota in the Mississippi watershed. And the whole villages from like Gull Lake and stuff like that got moved up to White Earth. And then a lot of the people from Mille Lacs did too. So especially the villages like Rice Lake and Nadawash have a lot of Mississippi band members. And there'll be some other ones. If it says Pillager, you probably came out of Ottertail Lake Village south of White Earth and moved up to the Ponsford Two Inlets area. If it says Pemina band member, probably came from the western parts of Ojibwe country. There were Ojibwe people living way out by Sisseton and stuff like that. And the Pemina band members were brought to the Mahnomen area of the reservation. Of course, we're all mixed and stuff like that. Some of you might be Lake Superior band members too, brought over from Fond du Lac or other places because they were trying to move all of us to White Earth. In any event, that's more of a sidebar. And I was called to this meeting in Mille Lacs. This is pre-pandemic, and it was a pretty interesting meeting. They said, look, we've got some money from grants, mainly grants related to workforce development. And most, like all the tribes get these, you know, taro and workforce development dollars for different grant programs. And so mostly it was used to hire people and teach them, you know, baseline entry level employment tools and opportunities, which is a good thing. But they said what we'd really like to do, we've had a lot of overages, especially, you know, that have kind of built up, and the money's going to go away if we don't spend it. So we'd like to think about, instead of just teaching people how to work in service type jobs, how to teach our people to work around our language and culture. And I said, well, how much money are you talking about spending on this stuff? And they said, our overages are about $14 million. If you could imagine that, I almost spit my teeth out. And so I had to say, you know, all right. At that point, they had identified, they'd done a language survey, and they had identified only 25 remaining fluent first speakers of Ojibwe in Mille Lacs. Now, Mille Lacs is, you know, not as big as White Earth in terms of tribal population, but still pretty big, like 6,000 tribal members, 25 speakers over the age of 70. You know, it wasn't looking super great. And so I said, you're not going to like send them all back to college, get them teaching degrees and send them back to teach for 30 years. You're going to have to do something different. And I said, how about this? Why don't we develop Rosetta Stone for Ojibwe? And for those who aren't familiar, Rosetta Stone, there's some of these language learning platforms like Duolingo, Babbel, Rosetta Stone. They're just different companies that do the work. And it basically uses, instead of just like flashcards or things like that, it's got video, audio, talking flashcards, artificial intelligence to correct pronunciation as you interact with an app on a smartphone, things like that, and also correct grammar as you interact with an app. And so I said, let's do Rosetta Stone, let's do a literacy initiative and build, create some new books for the Ojibwe language. And they said, okay, let's do all of it. And they did. It's pretty amazing what happened. We had to assemble a team of about 50 people. There were many different issues. And if you're interested, as we get to questions, feel free to ask a little more. Even the structure of a contract ended up being really significant because questions came up. Are you going to let a non-native owned company copyright our language, profiteer off of our colonization? Our people have been ripped off by so many people, so many ways. There was a discomfort, right? And what would happen if there's a new tribal election, because we have them every 2 years in most of the Ojibwe reservations, and the next tribal council says, why are they spending so much money on language? And they want to pull the plug when it's going to take years to develop something like this. And so I said, let's do this with our contract. Let's put in punitive escape clauses. So if someone tries to kill the whole thing, they won't be able to claw the money back out. Let's make sure that the band can retain the copyright and can reuse any content developed, all the recordings, raw footage, everything, for anything that they want, and any family member can have access to anything their elders and family members have done at any time. And they agreed to everything. And even though Mille Lacs makes it free for tribal members, and there's kind of a nominal fee of $40 for other native folks and $100 for institutions, they actually anticipate getting all of their money back. And in the long run, this will have cost them nothing. It's pretty cool. There's more to say about Rosetta Stone and how that works. It does push to an app on your phone. If you go, like I put links into the website, into my website, and I've got Rosetta Stone hyperlink there. It'll take you to the Mille Lacs Band Anji Bimadizing program. And so we've got 2 years of it developed. There's a 3rd year coming out any day now. And then there'll be another year every year until they have a 6-year development, which will be the biggest development for any tribal language in history. And what's also cool is that the tribe can then turn around and say everybody who works for the Mille Lacs Band of Ojibwe has a special privilege to be our employee. We expect all of our employees, native, non-native, alike, to demonstrate this level of competency in the Ojibwe language. And here's the tool to do it, and the assessments are built into the tool. By the way, for those who are going into education and really care about language and stuff like that, there's a teacher guide for each year of Rosetta Stones, and it's free. So the teacher guide for year 1 of Rosetta Stone is 500 pages of lesson plans, recommended uses for the material and content. So even if you're not a fluent speaker, but you've got a certain level of language knowledge, then you can pick up the program and start implementing it with your kids. Year 2 has another 500-page teacher guide. It is free, full of examples and lesson plans and things like that. So it's a really rich resource that's very accessible and can be used not just for individuals who want to mess around on their smartphone, but for classroom integrations too. So there's some pretty cool stuff there. We got the first 5 books in the literacy program out. We convinced the Minnesota Historical Society Press to publish all of them, even though no one on their staff can read them. I was especially proud of that one. And so it's off to a really good start. It took us a little while, the pandemic was tough. In Mille Lacs, they lost 6 of their 25 fluent speakers during the pandemic, including some of the folks in this picture here. And that's about 20% of their fluent speakers in Mille Lacs passed during the pandemic. And I think many other tribal communities had similarly difficult experiences during the pandemic. On your far left with the buzz cut, Joe Naquinabe is a revered spiritual leader and ceremonial drum keeper from Mille Lacs. And he lost a sister to COVID, and he had a brother who got COVID, had heart complications, and passed. And when we finally came out of the pandemic and it became safe to assemble, it took some years to do this. We were able to assemble and kind of celebrate the accomplishments. And we were telling stories like Carol Nickerboy, and she's in the middle of the pile there. I remember one time we actually had to during the pandemic, send a computer and a grandchild to every elder's house and teach them how to do work sessions over Zoom and stuff like that. And I remember calling Carol and I said, Carol, it's time for our Ojibwe session. Oh, Tagiz Wagosh, Hajangi busy kan babizi kawagan, Tage Bigamigong Niwija. And so she said, well, Wagosh, I already got my coat on. I was going to go to the casino. I said, casino? Are you serious? There's a pandemic. You're supposed to stay home and be safe. She said, well, the language is more important. She takes her coat off. And we ended up working for a couple of hours. And then she says, well, I'm going to go to the casino now. My niece has been waiting in the car the whole time, which is totally ridiculous in the middle of the winter. And, but that's how dedicated they were to all of the efforts. We had Joe get up there, and I thought he would just say, like, this whole pandemic was just like the hardest thing. And he kind of floored me. He said, you know, we've been through a lot. We've been through a lot the past few years. And we've been through a lot the past few hundred years. But I have to say, seeing all of these young people coming around, seeing how much they care about our language and our culture, seeing what they've been able to do for our kids, knowing that our elders will be teaching people our language for hundreds of years to come, I have to say that this has been the happiest time of my life. And it was a reminder to me, all of us need healing. Our elders need healing, and they find it when we pick up our language and culture. Our young people need healing and connection and love, and they also find it when we pick up our language and our culture. It is such powerful medicine. Yeah, Roger Jourdain from Red Lake, he was pretty hilarious. He said, the Bureau of Indian Affairs is the first instance of organized crime on the reservation, which I always thought was a pretty awesome quote. And, you know, all of the tribes in our area have been working so hard to build things. And for those of you who are in this education cohort, who are learning and picking up tools and thinking about how to apply them and be at the service of our kids, it's time to pick up that sovereignty and wield it for the best benefit of our young people. I think sometimes we get a little bit inhibited because we experience shame. And, you know, this is something, all Western cultures have a shame issue. And I think it probably even could have started with the religious traditions where, you know, there's a right way to do it and a wrong way to do it, and you're going to get judged by God and all these different things. So people are terrified of being judged or exposing an ignorance. And we sometimes shy away from things we don't know as much about, which could be our own language, because we're worried about exposing an ignorance or feeling like we're getting caught flat-footed or not having all the answers. But you know what? We're right where we should be, having been through all of the crap that we've been through. And here we are. And so one of the things I think is important to communicate at the start is that you are a complete, fully realized human being. You are a soul who has a body. You are the one your ancestors were praying for and waiting for through the generations. You have been given a unique set of gifts, and you yourself are a gift to the world. And when we adopt that frame, it's so much easier to move forward and do the things. There are many, many examples of positive approaches to the positive identity development of Native kids. I'll give you a little bit of some of these, like the Hawaiians are certainly one big example. And I'll show you a couple more. And then between this and then some of this we're going to save for Thursday. And I'll do more of a personal introduction of myself. I may not have time to take you on a deep dive into it today, but I'll do a little more on Thursday as well, as we start talking about and exploring what this could really look like. But one model is an expeditionary model. There are about 30 formal expeditionary schools in America, but there are many, many schools, including the whole Montessori model and others, that adopt some of these principles. And the ideas with this model are simply that kids shouldn't be held there passive and then writing a written exam. They should be up and learning and moving around, and there are many ways to approach learning. One of the other things that's very helpful is the teacher doesn't have to be the content expert on everything. I was just down in Elk River, which is like one of the Twin Cities suburban schools. They have 70 different languages spoken by kids in their district. 70. What teacher is going to know all 70 languages? Nobody, you know? And so it's a tremendous benefit to teachers. Like, it's helpful in the racial equity space, because sometimes if someone doesn't know and they're thinking, oh, if I say this, about Columbus, Italian Americans are going to get mad at me if I say that. Have you ever seen an angry native mom? What am I going to do? As little as possible. And then the response is built around teacher comfort instead of student needs. But if the teacher doesn't have to be the expert and can ask good guiding questions and coach learning, and kids can exhibit knowledge, it's a very different experience. So with the Columbus example, for example, like I had a fifth grader in an expeditionary school, and they had a Columbus thing. So the part of the lesson plan at the fifth grade level was put Columbus on trial. Each kid writes their own court opinion as if they're the judge, and nobody was graded on their opinion. They were graded on, did they exhibit knowledge of the geography, of the history, and things like that? Could they back their points up? And so teacher didn't have to pick sides in a culture war. They just had to guide the kids to good information and ask good questions. And oftentimes the questions are, what is photosynthesis and how does it work? And things like that. So that's one example of an approach that's a little different than some of the approaches we've seen, in Western models that seems to work. Also, I think what I've been told is that a lot of you are moving towards early childhood education space. But one of the things that happens in America's school systems, and by the way, tribal schools, for the most part, are operating with state curricular guidelines. It's kind of maddening that it's that way. But if you're going to take money, for per pupil funding for a school, that money's kind of coming through a state protocol, then the state expects you to deliver on their curricular guidelines. And so we end up doing a number of things, like you can put a brown face on assimilation and it's still assimilation. Put a brown face on colonization, it's still colonization. And so it's difficult for us operating within these systems because the systems can be so restrictive. And so it's difficult to get things funded without, getting in partnership with state systems. But there are ways to navigate these systems for the best benefit of kids. And by the way, this year we've had one of the most sweeping overhauls of state curricular guidelines. It's a very positive development. They're asking all teachers to speak to Indigenous ways of knowing in science. So even a second grader needs to know the life cycle of a plant, but we can do that in an Indigenous context. Also, they're asking, teachers of all across the state to speak about Indigenous people, not just as a unique ethnic or racial grouping, but as distinct political groups. And what is in tribal government and how does it work? And so even with the early childhood levels, there are things to kind of build up within the curriculum. Usually as kids get older, like the scope, sequence, objectives, outcomes, benchmarks, it grows wider. And so teachers get more specialized as they go up in the grades. But there's some really cool things to be learned from an integrated curricular approach as well. So I'll mention briefly the Waduka dotting again, which applies some of this integrated curricular approach. And they might do something like, assemble the whole school, all grades, bring them all out to go harvest wild rice. And then they'll ask the kids, Anish minik manomenge tuingo maji maning, like how much rice can you fit inside of a canoe? Which if you think, that is a very complex mathematical question. So the kids are like, okay, rectangle and a triangle and another triangle, fill the whole canoe full of water, pour it in these cylinders, double check your measurements. Hey, we got that right. The second graders need to know the life cycle of a plant, so they'll study that. They make a tobacco offering. They go out and harvest the rice, they bring it back to the school, and they'll do the music unit as they are parching and then jigging the rice to separate the hulls. They winnow. The kids bring some rice home to their families, so they are providing for their families, and they're doing extension stuff back in the school where they're saying, this is a superfood. What is a superfood? What does that mean? What's the nutritional value for a serving? How many calories in a serving? If it's a staple food, how much might one person eat in a year? And if on a reservation like this, they got kind of like Whiter, several different villages, and you've got this many people in this one and this many in that one, how much might you need to feed them all in a year? And then some years, let's do some graphing exercises. The yield's higher. Some years it's lower. And so let's look at how much you'd need to sustain this population over many years. And the kids do that, and then they're looking around like, wow, our ancestors did that? And the teacher's like, no, you just did that. And so all of a sudden, there's like building of self-esteem, confidence, a connection to ancestors. They're getting all their curricular content, and so this just provides another mechanism by which we can do that. This is a dude in Bemidji, chief of police. We got Ojibwe language signage on the cop cars even. Gunawange gang, Minawa Nadama gang to protect and serve. And I think we can indigenize all our spaces, the Indigenous spaces most of all, but even mixed company spaces. A lot of schools are employing, bilingual signage and other things that speak to this for our kids. All right. So what I'm going to do, I did want to hold a little bit of time. I've got about a half hour left. I got enough stuff to keep us busy for days. But what I'm going to do is drop the PowerPoint for a minute, and so we can see each other a little bit better. And I'm just going to open up space where we can all talk a little bit and have a conversation. And so I think we're small enough in number. If you'd like to make a comment or if you'd like to ask a question, you can just unmute and go ahead and shout it out. If we start talking over each other, we can move it into the chat there. Who wants to get me started? And if you're feeling a little shy, that's all right, because I got plenty of other stuff I can pull up and start showing you too.
Dr. Treuer, when did you learn your language? Was it from an early age or was it later in life?
Haha, it's probably a little bit of both. So I did grow up, in Native space. My mom was really active at ceremonies and I got exposure. But honestly, I consider myself a very unlikely candidate to know much about our language. My father is not Native. He spoke good German and English, and my mom's mom got taken from her parents and sent to residential boarding school, forbidden to speak Ojibwe. So it was a relearning effort even for my mom. And for me, I had a pretty cool experience. I think I finished high school thinking I'm going to get out of town and never come back. A lot of high schoolers come up with that plan. I also thought I was escaping like all the racism and issues. I ended up going to high school in Bemidji, border town dynamics and stuff like that. And I went to school out east. And by the time I finished going to school for college, I was like, I want to come home and never leave. And I told my parents, I said, I'm going to come home, hang out with my elders, do ceremonies, learn about our language. And I'm not taking a job and I'm not going to grad school. They said, oh, that's beautiful. Good luck paying for that because we're done. But I just did it anyways. And I ended up connecting with this guy named Archie Mose, who was really a cool guy. He was born in 1901. His namesakes were like veterans of the U.S. Civil War. It's like, sounds like just so far back. And but he had a very long life. When I met him in the early 1990s, he was living in a small modern house watching WWF SmackDown on a TV and laughing really loud. And I went to go see him and he shut off the TV and he said, oh, I've been waiting for you. I said, what? How could you be waiting for me? You don't know who I am. But I looked like he had a dream about someone and I looked like this person in his dream. For him, that was enough. He said, just sleep on the couch. So I ended up moving in with him and I slept on his couch. He'd get me up at like 5 a.m. Get up. You got to drive me. We're going to a funeral today. Because he did a lot of ceremonies and stuff. And so what I ended up getting was a really great immersion experience in our language and culture. And I did everything else you could imagine. I took classes, I studied, I worked hard, I taped labels on the salt and pepper shakers, and everything I could think of. And now, I can rattle and roll and do ceremonies. It's all in the language and stuff like that. And so um, I just love our language so much. And one of my namesakes said, if you ever learn something, teach it to at least 4 other people. So that always has me thinking, I better do everything I can to make sure I share this with our people. So that was a little bit on my journey. I wrote I guess I didn't tell you that much about myself yet, but so I told you a little bit about where I'm from and where I work. I also write a lot of books. And so one of them is called The Language Warriors Manifesto. And it's kind of explains my journey and our collective journey about language learning. So that might be helpful. There's another one, I think I had it in one of the slides a couple minutes ago. The Cultural Toolbox, kind of about culture stuff. And I've got other ones out too. I've got a young reader novel coming out here in June. And there's a everything you wanted to know about Indians, but we're afraid to ask, kind of fun but wide-ranging topics in that one. Good question. Any others? I'm just holding space for you.
Ani Anton. My name's Kathy DeVoy. I'm from Sault Ste. Marie, Michigan.
Uh-huh.
And I missed your workshops over here a couple of weeks ago, so that's the way I tuned into this when I saw it come up in my email.
Mm-hmm.
And I'm really glad I did. I mean, you've really got my mind working, and I'm glad to hear all this. And I'm a retired teacher,
Mm-hmm.
35 years of teaching culture and language. I'm like you, I grew up around the language, with the language, but had to, they'd send you out the room when they wanted to speak to each other because they didn't want you to learn it or anything, anytime but I used to eavesdrop. So,
Yeah. Oh, that's good.
so as time goes on as an adult, I was able to go back and at least learn enough to, have a little conversation and to at least teach some beginning level.
Mm-hmm.
But I'm retired now, and 2 weeks after I retired, I took a job with my tribe, uh, our Anishinaabe Bimadiziwin department, their director.
Uh-huh.
And the reason I tuned in is because I'm charged with grant writing now, and I have to write an ANA grant. And I just needed some inspiration, and I just wanted to say, you've given me a lot of inspiration. And I'm actually feeling a little bit sad because I'm at the end of my career, I guess you'd call it. I mean, I'm always going to be a grandma and an elder. And yeah, I just see the things that you're talking about and the changes that have happened over the year. Like I could turn into that, you know, colonized way of thinking, even though we have tribal schools, because that's mostly where I worked was tribal schools. And they, talking about integrating or other models that could have been done differently. It was like banging my head against the wall to get them to understand that we have to do this.
Mm-hmm.
So I'm really glad to see that there's, up and coming educators here that are going in that direction.
Oh, yeah.
It's mm. So mine was more of a comment than a question.
Yeah. I appreciate it. Thank you so much for the comment, and thank you for all your years of service to educating Native kids and everybody else. That's wonderful. I certainly agree with you about, the importance of these things with our kids. When I went to school, I didn't have a way to talk about this when I was going to school because I was just a kid, but I remember thinking about, people in my family tree and how come I never had a chance to learn about any of them, when I was going to school. And so in many ways, it was like the absent narratives were screaming at me. You and yours just aren't important, aren't relevant, don't matter. Because if it was important, relevant, or mattered, somebody would have said something in 13 years of an education, And so I think this is one of the things that's hard for people to understand. Like when people talk about like white privilege, it's not like financial advantage. It's
Mm-hmm.
the advantage of going to school and your race is widely represented in who's teaching and who's being taught about, and things like that. And if you're Native, you could go to school for 13 years in a row and never learn about a single Native person. And
Mm-hmm.
we're just starting to change that,
Yeah.
and so I think it's very important work
Mm-hmm.
because when our kids know about themselves, they'll succeed.
Yeah, that's true. I know I was blessed. I had a grandma and a great grandma that made darn sure that I know who our people were, even if they didn't in school. But also
Hmm.
back in the 60s and 70s, it was with that period of quote unquote revolution, I guess you'd call it.
Yeah.
There were things starting to happen, and so yeah, when my grandma pointed her little finger at me and said, "You got to go to school and bring something back to your people," there
Mm.
went my art career.
Ah.
So yeah, it's been quite a journey. I'm really glad to see people working so hard to do that and go to a conference like that was 2 weeks ago and have 900 people, 900 Indians under the same roof.
Oh
Yeah,
yeah.
it
I've been
was
going to Anishinaabe and Tag out there since the beginning. They've been
yeah, me
going
too.
30 years. Yeah.
Yeah,
Yeah, so
me
it's pretty
too.
cool. Yeah, so 900 people at this language conference, and
Uh-huh.
it's pretty inspiring to think about.
Yeah,
There are a lot of people who really do care.
yeah. And it's right in my back door, so down the street,
Hmm.
literally. So it
Yeah.
was, yeah. So miigwech
All
for
right, Miigwech Gagin.
carrying on that work.
Oh yeah,
So
no one does it alone.
yeah,
Any other questions? See, Maxine had to take off. That's okay, Maxine. We'll see you on Thursday.
Mine is kind of a comment as well. Back in
Mm-hmm.
the 1990s, I was attending the LCO Community College as a student, and then I started working there way back when Weedukadotting first began. And I can
Mm-hmm.
remember the little elders, Harriet Panas, Clara Beebe, and Ruth Carley were so ecstatic that that was starting. All the elders were over the moon with that.
Mm-hmm.
And
Yeah.
I can remember the feelings when it all began and how it started with nothing and a little room and then a building. And so, you know, the work is very important and the elders are very excited and they're still, I'm sure, working on the other side to help us out.
Yeah,
Me,
I certainly agree. Yeah, it's interesting. I've learned a lot about the fundraising universe too, even though I'm not like really a grant writer or something like that, although I have written grants. Um, and one of the things I've learned is that a lot of the funders, whether it's private philanthropy or the, big foundation money or federal grants, they usually don't give just because they see that there's a need. They usually give money where they feel like there's strength. So like if there's a program or an effort that looks like it's really going to produce results, the money starts to flow a little bit more. And so when you can show strength, not just the need, you do need to show need too, but you show that we have the capability of doing that. Usually that helps produce better results. And like just this year, Wadukadading got written in as a line item in the Wisconsin budget for like $5 million for facility funding, and then had a private philanthropist out of nowhere donate $1.5 million. Like that's huge money. And so that was just unimaginable when we were starting there, which is probably 22, 23 years ago now. Pretty exciting. And that doesn't mean that it's like everything's perfect now. Like, I'm on the school board. They got plenty of stresses, but at the same time, it's encouraging and hopeful. Other
So when it comes to
questions?
the
Yeah.
Rosetta Stone, I know Ojibwe Mon, like other languages, has different dialects and whatnot. Does it address any of that, or is it strictly Mille Lacs dialect?
Great question. So yes, it's worth mentioning, first of all, that Ojibwe is not really one language. It is a collection of interrelated language dialect groupings. And there's even a lot of cultural variation across Ojibwe country. And some of that is just because we cover a huge geography. Some of it is really cultural. Like, if you think about the great migration of our people, from the Atlantic coast, if somebody got too bossy or even got too much influence, someone else is moving down the river saying, they're not my chief, you know? And so, our people, I think, tended to be pretty tolerant of cultural variation. Oh, that's what they do there. Here's what we do here, but pretty intolerant of being told what to do. I don't know how many of you have family members like that. I got quite a few, but ultimately, if you even look, like, I've been out to Temagami First Nation, which is on the Quebec border, and I've been out to, like, Turtle Mountain, North Dakota, or Rocky Boy, Montana. Wild rice doesn't even grow in any of those places. But that's like Ojibwe soul food, throughout the Central Great Lakes and certainly northern Minnesota. And so,
Not here.
wild rice is a huge part of culture, but you wouldn't tell someone at Turtle Mountain or Rocky Boy they're not Ojibwe, and you wouldn't tell someone at Temagami they're not Ojibwe. That's just an example of cultural variation. And that does happen within language too, where, you could even hear Catherine when she was saying Ani, Ani, Anishna, Nishin. There are a few different ways, like that's just a dialect thing. Ani, Anin, Nishin instead of Onijishin, but we can understand each other just fine. And so I think it's important to respect all of the variation within the language. The Rosetta Stone that was developed in Mille Lacs is specific to the Mille Lacs dialect. They said, we're funding this, we're going to do this with our speakers in our community, but there's a need for this in many other places. So anyone else who wants to do Rosetta Stone, we will provide all of our templates, building blocks, lessons learned, curricular guides. And then all you have to do, like if we Quemakong or something wanted to do Rosetta Stone, they'd have to record all fresh audio and video. So it's specific to the dialect and make all the adaptations. But they'd have a lot of work in infrastructure pre-built that they could piggyback off of, so they would be able to go a little faster. And they said, we will provide all of that for free for any other community that wants to do it. I know, like, in Canada, for those who aren't familiar, out of their Truth and Reconciliation effort, they have some pretty significant monies that have been allocated. And then the Robinson-Huron Treaty settlement is pretty huge. It's billions. And so the tribes are talking about making comparable investments for language revitalization. And it could take this form or other forms too.
I know over here, you Western Ojibways call us vowel droppers because we drop all kinds of vowels. But I should say, teach the students how, the differences, so that when we have a lot of books and materials that come from Wisconsin and Minnesota, and we teach them how to read it, and that's okay that there's an O in front of that. That's, shows you different dialect, but it still means the same thing. We can understand each other. And we got a conversion of not just Ojibwe, but we've got Odawa people and Potawatomi, and where we're at on the border. We're at the tip of the Upper Peninsula on the Canadian border. So yeah, it's interesting.
Yeah, for sure.
So
Melinda, were you gearing up with a question there?
Well, I've been trying to think of a good one. I've been in education a long time, and I'm actually teaching back in K-12. Again, I was in higher ed for about 12 years. And in my previous school, I was actually the Indian ed coordinator, and I think that was probably just 90% because I used to be the academic dean at White Earth Tribal and Community College, so they were like, yeah, that'll work. But at that point, I understood that I had gleaned so much from the experience of the exposure, and I had been given a spiritual guide, and so I went through a lot of this process that I miss so much of that now, being back in public education. Just the every day when I was at tribal college, being able to use the sweetgrass and smudge my office, things like that. You can't even do ceremonial things. So recently, excuse me, I have a cold. I am in a book study where I am studying with I'm an English teacher, and I'm studying with a bunch of math teachers. Your book, everything that you wanted to know about Indians, but you're afraid to ask. And that has been fascinating because math teachers are an interesting breed.
Yes.
But one thing that we have been wrestling with, and in particular, they have been wrestling with, is how can they teach culturally relevant material that doesn't necessarily translate to be culturally relevant. You know, like how is it that we can marry in? I can't create a curriculum here that would be K-12, but what is it that I can do in my classroom that would welcome and enrich a curriculum?
Oh yeah, that's a great question. And I'll probably, spend some of the time on our next session kind of getting into that one in a little more depth. But ultimately, you know, even like with the little Waduka example I was using, all the kids need to know the life cycle of a plant. We can talk about that in an Indigenous context. And so it's not like you're going to either do the Indigenous stuff or you're going to do the plants. No, you can do them both at the same time. I ran into someone, I'm on the governing board for this Minnesota State Historical Society, and somebody was complaining about the state standards on there. There's all this diversity in Indigenous stuff, and our kids hardly understand the Constitution as it is. And I remember saying, like, are you saying that, like, the white guys are America and everything else is not? And so it's going to detract from understanding America. If you just look at like the Haudenosaunee, the Iroquois Confederacy, originally there were 5 tribes. They used to fight each other. They made peace, bundled up their implements of war, buried them at the base of a great pine tree. It's where we get the saying to bury the hatchet. And then afterwards, each kept its own language, culture, customs, but they had a common political entity. So America's founding fathers, Jefferson and Franklin, wrote about the Haudenosaunee. And they wrote about, the ancient Greeks, the idea of voting, the ancient Romans, the idea of a Senate, and the Haudenosaunee, and how you'd have independent states part of a common nation. If you talk about the Indigenous stuff, you will understand America better. It will not detract or take time away from your understanding of America. It's the exact opposite. And I think that's the case with just about everything. Yes, we can teach our kids, the English language too, and we can do that in a way, where they're learning about all kinds of other stuff. Like, Louise Erdrich just won a Pulitzer Prize for her publication of an English language book. I got a new one coming out in June, right there. It's called Where Wolves Don't Die. It's a young reader novel, so it's accessible for English language learners, and it's full of our culture, communities, and all kinds of things. And so, I think really what I hear when people say, I don't even know how to do Indigenous stuff, is nobody gave this to me on a silver platter, and I'm too scared to lean in. And so it's like, just be brave, lean in. There's lots of stuff we can do. There are lots of ways to go about doing it. I realize that probably none of us got it handed on a silver platter. But if we know that there's enough to know there's stuff we don't know, then we just got to lean in, and our kids deserve it. All of our kids, by the way, not just our Native kids. Our Native kids deserve to learn about themselves in addition to the rest of the world. But like our white kids, we have to prepare them for the world that's actually going to be out there. And we might only be able to imagine the world they have to live in, but we have to imagine it'll be a diverse place. It's a disservice to the white kids if they only learn about white guy stuff.
Yeah.
Right? It's a benefit to them if they learn about everybody else and how to get along. So,
exactly.
We got to do this for everybody.
I had the one time I taught in a public school, and this was really a white school, but there were some Native kids there, so a good percentage, so they hired me. And I taught, Native culture and language there. None of my degrees were in that. I was an English major. Anyway, years later, and I'd had a mixed group, and this one kid, I mean, he was really white, red hair, Irish, the whole 9 yards, little pain in the neck, but he and one of the things I always taught the kids, I said, because they complain, I don't know why I'm in here. I thought this was an easy A. No, I said, if you come out of here learning anything, it's that there are many different people in the world, and you have to be, aware of that and live with that. So he came back about 10 years later. He stopped me in the grocery store and he said, Mrs. DeVoy, I have to tell you, because he went in the Marines, that the only really good lesson I remember from high school is what you taught us. And I said, what did I teach you? And he said that people are different. There are so many different people, and you have to stop and respect that, because the town he came from, all the boys went into the Army or Marines, and they're going out there in the world with all kind of people that don't look like them.
Yeah.
So that was always kept that one right there. So if nothing
That's really
else,
good.
you got, yeah.
I know we got a lot of different kinds of folks on the talk today, but I wanted to say something to the students too. First of all, I just want to thank you for considering becoming an educator. We need you. We need you so bad. Our kids need you. And, being an educator is hard work. So I have found that it's very helpful for me as an Indigenous person to make some time and make it a regular thing where I am tending to my self-care. That's everything from like my body to the food to the exercise to whatever, but also caring for my own peace of mind and cultural development and things like that, because the rest of the world can eat you up. It can be kind of adversarial sometimes. And so take time for yourself to get to your ceremonies, to connect with your community and your people. And that, like, we're all wired a little bit differently, but kind of recharge your batteries so you have more for yourself and for the kids. And then, some of the work is that, like taking care of myself, taking care of community and, my own spiritual nurturing. And then my obligation is to serve and represent and, get out there and do the things. And we've got to do both of them. And there probably is kind of like whatever crap sandwich that comes with every job that a person ends up taking in life. So, nothing is going to be devoid of anything, that you don't like, but you figure out how to navigate the parts that are more uncomfortable by, picking something that you really believe in and that you have, you're building some skills and expertise around, and it'll be just a tremendous service to our people. And you just never know which drop, pebble in the pond is going to make such big ripples. I remember when I was a kid, when my mom was a kid, she went to school. She was born in the Cass Lake Indian Hospital on the Leech Lake Res, raised in Bena her whole life, went to school in Cass Lake. Her whole childhood, she only met one professional Native American person ever. That person was the school nurse. So she thought, maybe I could do that. And she ended up going to nursing school. And then after nursing school, came back to work for the tribe and then for their health program and thought, geez, even here we're getting pushed around. I'm going to do something about that. She went back to school and got a law degree and became the first female Native attorney in the state of Minnesota. And so she was a tribal judge at White Earth, Boys Fort, did some other work up at Red Lake, And so when I was a kid, she'd bring me with her to court and she'd say, you just sit there and don't say a word. So, I'd sit there and not say a word. And I can't remember all of her court cases, but what I really remember is, that she was the only woman in court and that she and her law partner, Paul Day, they were the only natives in court. And I'd walk out of there thinking, you know what? We can do stuff. We just had the retirement celebration for Paul Day. And I had to tell him, I said, you were the first Native man I ever saw doing anything professional. And it had a tremendous impact on me. And we were in a room full of Native judges, lawyers, educators, and social workers. I said, look how far we've come. We've come a long, long way. And we still have a long way to go. But nothing can stop a Native person who knows who they are. And no matter what part of the education work you're in, that's the mission right there. I'm hitting the clock for 6:30, but part 2, Thursday, same time. And I'm not sure if it's the same or if it's a different link, but pay attention to what was on the poster and the information that was going out. Really appreciate you all. Miigwech for tuning in, everybody. Miigwech.
Miigwech, Anton.
Mm-hmm.
Bamapi Guaman.
Aha, bamapi, miigwech. Miigwech for watching today. I'm Anton Treuer.